Welcome to the session Web Development with Delphi and TMS Web Core. My name is Holger Flick from Flick's Engineering LLC. My company offers training, consulting, software development, and in the recent year, I've published several books about Delphi. If you want to contact me, leave an email at holger@flicksengineering.com. You may also reach me at info@tmssoftware.com, as I'm also an evangelist for TMS software. The following session has been pre-recorded because of the uncertainty in the weather where I'm working right now, so hopefully I'll be available for your questions after this pre-recorded part. Here's the agenda for this session. Before deep diving into web development with Delphi, I would like to motivate why we have to deal with web development at all. For that, we're going to look at Delphi's strengths and the challenges we as Delphi developers have to meet today. Then I'm going to introduce TMS Web Core, give the general approach to the development with TMS Web Core, explain the web design options that you have. I'm also going to focus on how to incorporate existing databases into your projects and also how to use other services. And of course, if any of you have read my books, examples are the main part of this session. We're going to look at examples that have been created with TMS Web Core, so you can decide pretty quickly if TMS Web Core is worth a look for you after this session. And of course, as already mentioned, I'll be available for your questions after this theoretical part. So let's look at the strengths of Delphi. Of course, the first strength is object-oriented programming. We all come from a structured programming language, and then Delphi being able to use the object-oriented approach was a major milestone for us. Of course, if we're honest, we did not even look at the object-oriented part at first, and that's yet another strength of Delphi, because even if you weren't as schooled in the object-oriented programming languages, you were able to build applications with Delphi. And that's due to its rapid application development approach. You were able to add a form to a project, drop some visual controls, change properties of those controls, how they would look and behave, and also you were able to add events, what happens if you click on something, double click on something, and so on. At that point, you didn't write a single line of code. Of course, you were also able, and that's the next strength of Delphi, you're also able to add databases pretty quickly to all your applications. T-Dataset and T-Datasource have been major parts of Delphi from the beginning, and they're still there today. And then the next step was to run the application, and you could use your application right away, and the differences from design time to runtime were minimal. Because of the object-oriented approach, it was very easy to extend the existing frameworks that came with Delphi for other companies, and that led to a huge third-party market. So it is very easy to find additional visual and non-visual controls for Delphi. Also, interoperability with any device was very easy due to the native code that Delphi produces. Also, even though we're talking Delphi 1 times, network access was easily possible. Today we have components for HTTP, FTP, and all other controls that are part of the ISO OC model. However, in recent times, requirements changed significantly. Development for one platform does no longer suffice. When the first version of Delphi was conceived, Microsoft Windows was the major platform that we were developing software for. But nowadays, this is no longer the case. In addition to Microsoft Windows, you at least have to consider Apple macOS desktop applications, if not even Linux applications. Especially on the server side, Linux has become a major player. And of course, all of us, when we ride on the bus, on the train, everybody has a smartphone and a tablet. So Android and Apple iOS are also very important platforms to deliver your software to. These are the development challenges that we have to take care of as Delphi developers. We have to make sure that our product is compatible with multiple platforms. One approach, of course, is to use FireMonkey instead of the VCL. Migrating applications from the VCL to FireMonkey is of course possible. Back in the day, it was a good idea to separate the user interface from the business logic, but nowadays you really have to make sure that you separate your user interface from your business logic in order to be able to have different user interfaces for different platforms. Especially thinking about mobile applications and desktop applications, you simply can't use the same user interface even when using a framework that is available for desktop platforms as well as mobile platforms. You have to use different user interfaces, in my opinion. And that makes me say that you still need custom development for each operating system. TMS has an approach purely based on Delphi controls called framework neutral controls that can be used in the VCL as well as FireMonkey and other Object Pascal frameworks, for example, also TMS Web Core. So the same controls can be used for web application development. These controls have the big advantage that you only need to learn about each control or component once. You can use the same control in the VCL and in FireMonkey. So it is good practice to use the framework neutral controls instead of the VCL controls if they're available from TMS. Because the framework neutral controls have the same properties, events, and methods in each of the frameworks. So in a nutshell, using framework neutral controls shortens the learning curve significantly. If you're interested in that framework, look on TMS YouTube channel. They have plenty of training videos for framework neutral controls. But today we're going to focus purely on web development. And this leads me to the statement, take the next step. Target all platforms and devices with one application. You just need to find an application type that is suitable and compatible. And web applications deliver exactly that, because web applications can be run inside of any HTML5 compatible web browser. So one solution might be that you migrate your existing projects to the web using a web framework, or if you don't want to take this step that quickly, try to target your new development for the web. But looking back at Delphi's strengths, will rapid application development be available for web applications? Because of Delphi, we want web development with an object-oriented programming language, we want rapid application development, and of course we want a toolkit with user interface control that gives us access to web services and cloud services. Also, we want to be able to use existing web frameworks and libraries because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. That's why we used Delphi in the first place, because we had such a huge amount of components available for purchase or even available for free. And of course, I skipped over that a little bit in the beginning. We want Xcopy deployment because as Delphi developers, we are used to have a single executable file that can be copied from computer to computer without the necessity of installing libraries. This started very early to be one of the #1 criteria why we use Delphi, if we're honest about it. If we think about Visual Basic, it had a 6 megabyte library that needed to be deployed, and nowadays the kids are like 6 megabytes, that's nothing. Well, back in the day that were 6 floppy disks, so you had to deploy 6 floppy disks plus your application in order to deploy a Visual Basic application. And with Delphi, that simply wasn't the case. Everything that was needed was linked into the executable. Most of the time, you only needed 1 floppy disk to deploy a Delphi application. So it would be wonderful if we had a solution like Delphi for the web. And you don't need to look any farther because TMS Web Core delivers exactly all those aspects that we as Delphi developers are used to. Now we are also able to develop web applications. TMS Web Core adds some significant tools to your belt. You can develop in the integrated development environment IDE that suits you best. Of course, today we're going to look at Red Studio and Delphi, but Lazarus and Microsoft Visual Studio Code are also available. You still will be able to use forms and frames with a form designer. Dozens of visual and non-visual controls are included in the base package of TMS Web Core. And you will also be able to use existing web frameworks that are written in JavaScript. You even have two choices there. You can either use the JavaScript framework as is, or you can create a Pascal wrapper class to make it even easier to use the framework. Of course, the programming language is Object Pascal, with a few additions that makes web development even easier. And the framework is TMS Web Core. Believe me, it is true rapid application development. You can create a web application, you drop components and controls on a form, and you can run and debug the application from the IDE. The compilation creates an HTML document, and the application will become a JavaScript application. The HTML can reference CSS for the web design, for example. On the right, you see an example of a web application that I wrote a couple of weeks ago. It is the application that allows you to order my books online. And on top, you see the JavaScript application with the extension .js. The main form has the forms.main.html for additional HTML design that you might want to add to your form design. And the index.html is the starting point for the application, which loads the JavaScript into your browser and does everything that needs to be done behind the scenes. As a major difference to other web frameworks that are available for Delphi, TMS Web Core does not create a server executable. TMS Web Core applications are true JavaScript plus HTML applications. Of course, the resources that you might add, like configuration files, images, will have to be deployed in the web as well. But TMS Web Core applications can be deployed easily onto any web server by simply copying the JavaScript and HTML files. This gives you a lot of flexibility. Also, you can host your web applications inside of a Docker container. Thus, it opens up a lot of opportunity for load balancing, clustering, and all other sorts that are required for high availability web applications. The sore point for Delphi developers when they look at web development are databases, because databases are so fun and easy to use inside of Delphi, but with web applications, there's a problem. Because web applications run inside of the web browser. That means they run outside of your local area network. So you can't connect and keep a connection to your database server. Everything on the web works without a connection. And communicating with a database is usually done using so-called web services using the HTTP protocol. The web application becomes the front end, and the database becomes the back end, which is accessed through a web service interface. TMS Web Core comes with components for any HTTP or REST web service. You probably know that there's lots and lots of different tools that allow you to create web services. Embarcadero Red Server is one of them, just like Embarcadero DataSnap. But also TMS offers TMS X Data to make creation of web services easy. Most of the time, you're able to create a web service that is based on a database and its tables. And creating queries based on these tables is easy. In TMS Web Core's case, you even have specific components that you can add to a form to access Xdata web services. But all these solutions also allow you to write web services from scratch completely. Then you write your own web services that do not have to be tied to a database, by the way. A lot of Delphi developers think that a web service requires a database backend. That is simply not the case. A common example for web services is that you want to protect your intellectual property and only want to offer your services through a web service interface. One example for a web service that does not depend on storing information in a database or retrieving information from a database is, for example, a text-to-speech web service. You send a string, and in return, you get a WAV file with the text spoken. Before we look at examples inside of the Delphi IDE, let me show you why I think rapid application development can still be done with TMS Web Core. I'll show you 3 different approaches to user interface design, and in the end, you'll understand why these 3 different kinds exist. First, there is the approach to simply drop components on a form like we're used from Delphi since version 1. On the left, you see the form designer. It's a screenshot from the Delphi IDE with the edit control, a button, a memo control, combo box, and a label. And on the right, you see what this form looks like on the web. This approach is designed for developers who need a web application quickly. You have your business logic, you need to build your user interface quickly in order to get your application into the web. It's also a great way to build the first version of a web application, which is not as polished. And also when you're still thinking about how to build the user interface. So this gives you a way to show how the application will work in the end. Of course, you won't get a veto from me if you say this is not what web applications should look like nowadays. I agree. Web applications should look more modern and shouldn't be just a transfer of desktop controls to the web. The challenges that this approach brings, even if you use alignment and anchors, they're not suitable for mobile devices, for example. This leads us to the second approach that you can take. You still use the form designer primarily, but you add CSS-specific tags to each control. In this example, we add a tag to the button and to the form controls, and you can immediately see that they look familiar because we're all used to the Bootstrap framework. Even if we don't know what the Bootstrap framework is, just seeing this design here on the right, you immediately recognize the rounded corners, the way the button looks, because the idea behind Bootstrap is that it delivers something that can be used on any device and delivers a common visual appearance that can be recognized and is easily usable. In addition to this, you also see the header that is not part of the form designer. The header is written completely in HTML, and only some of the texts are being delivered by the form designer. I'll show you an example how you can mix HTML and form design in Delphi. And this is the idea that TMS Web Core has. It strictly separates the application and the form design if you want. You can use the form design from the form designer completely. You can use the mix that you see here, or, and this is the third alternative, you download or you hire a professional web developer, web designer to create your HTML and CSS. And you're able to include, import these designs into your application and link your form controls to this existing design. And this is what you see here. On the left, you see the order number, order date with the two edit fields, and these have been linked to HTML design, which is provided by the web designer. You only need to communicate the tags to identify the different parts of the form. Otherwise, the design can be done by a completely different team than the application development. What you also see here is that, yet again, you have elements on the form which replace elements in the design. And also, common concepts like frames, as seen here, can be used to have a navigation that appears on each page of the web application. And even the well-known VCL action list has a control inside of TMS Web Core, the Web Element Action List. With TMS Web Core, you can create three application types: the classic web client application, the installable mobile application, PWA. The difference between the two is that the mobile application downloads to the device and can be run offline. The title here is a little bit misleading because you can also use a PWA application on a Windows desktop. The browser does the same thing. It downloads the application, and when your computer is offline, you can still use the application inside of the browser. So the PWA application template comes with functionality to download the application if there has been a change on the server, but if the server isn't there, the application can still be run because it is stored inside of the browser. Please do not confuse this with caching of information from a web service. This is still something that would need to be done by you. This only refers to the application part, that the application itself is downloaded and stored inside of the browser. And of course, if you make changes on the web server, meaning you provided an update for your application, the PWA template would automatically update the application on the device. And finally, And this is the most important aspect for you, because you might have said, you said we should take the next step and develop web applications. But your customers might not want to have a web browser or do everything inside of a web browser. Well, for this, I can say a desktop application is also a target for TMS Web Core. TMS recently introduced the Miletus framework, or Miletus framework. It gives you the ability to create applications, desktop applications inside of a form for Windows, macOS, and Linux. And the beauty of it is you can compile for all these operating systems from the Delphi IDE. You do not need the Linux compiler. You do not need any specific PA server. You can create these applications from Red Studio. So let's look at the examples. Let's get started by looking at the IDE integration of TMS Web Core into the latest version of Delphi, Delphi Sydney. With File, New, and Other, after installing TMS Web Core, be it the trial or the full version, you get a TMS Web category. There you will find the application types that you can create, as I just introduced, the TMS Web application, the TMS Web PW application, and the TMS Web Miletus application. Also still there is the TMS Web Electron application based on the Electron framework. The Electron framework has the same idea as TMS Web Miletus. However, the Electron framework adds a lot of libraries to your application. That is something that you won't have using TMS Web Miletus. So let's create a new TMS Web application. And I just want to show you how easy it is to get started if you've never built a web application with TMS Web Core before. Let me move the object inspector right here. And on the left in the tool palette, we find all the TMS Web controls, like a label, a button, an edit. Anything you are used to from the VCL is also part of TMS Web. So if you don't have any web-specific needs for your user interface and you don't want to build something that is based on Bootstrap with responsive design, you can use these controls right away. Also, I said responsive design. You can do that in a way using panels and alignment, of course. So wanting to build something that is responsive to the size of your browser window doesn't mean you have to go the difficult route. So let's drop a web edit, a button, and just as you're used to from the VCL, in the object inspector you see all the properties, and you can also implement the events for a button, for example, the onClick event. So double-clicking on the button, you can type web edit 1 dot, you get full code completion, text, and let's insert the current date and time. Date, time to string. Most RTL functions are also available. If you find an RTL function that is missing, just contact support from TMS Web Core. I'm sure they'll be able to provide either an alternative method or function that is embedded in another class, or they'll gladly add it to the RTL with the next release. So date, time to string, now. That's it. And I haven't saved the project or anything. I just run out of the IDE. You see it's compiling now. The web browser is starting. It appears in my other display. I drag it over, and here's your web application. I click the button, and there we have the time inside of the edit field. I will save a little bit of time by not adding a different caption or renaming the controls. You can all do that. You know how to do that using VCL applications. I want to spend our precious time showing you further examples for the different steps of the user interface design, and then I want to show you this application or a different application using TMS Miletus. So looking at the demo folder of TMS Web Core, you find plenty, not to say dozens, if not hundreds of different examples. They are grouped into different categories, for example, 3D, then you have FNC examples, jQuery examples, you have specific examples for Lazarus, for Miletus or Miletus. I can't really decide on the pronunciation. And the services for web services and other services that are already available as part of TMS Web Core. and Xdata specific examples, how to digest or how to consume TMS Xdata web services, and other web specific topics, for example, using a web camera or geolocation. Looking at the basics folder, the most important demos you should definitely have a look at is form inheritance, form hosting, and multi-form, which gives you an impression how you can manage navigating between different forms inside of an application and not just using one single form. All forms have the same principle, and I show you this right here. You have the unit and you have the DFM file, which is part of the designer, but you also have the HTML file, and that is key. This HTML file is added to each form. So you can put HTML and CSS and other web-specific code inside of this HTML file, and it will be merged in a way with your design that you specify. So you can link your controls, as already explained on the slides, to HTML code specified in this file. And this is done individually for each form. The Bootstrap example shows you how you can use Bootstrap to change the design of your controls on the form. So opening the main form, you see the example that was also given on the slides. You have TMS web specific controls like the T-Web Edit, the T-Web Button, the T-Web Memo, the T-Web Combo Box. And just as an aside, the properties are the same as in the VCL. So adding items to a combo box works the same way in TMS Web Core as it does in the VCL. And looking at each of these controls, you see that they have annotations in the element class name. And class name is the class name of the style sheet. And element refers to the terminology that is being used on the web for HTML tags. Each of these controls are an element on your HTML page. That's how you can remember it. It's not the formally correct academic description of it, but that's how I remember it in my head. So each of these things on the form is an element, and each element has an ID, it has a font, specific setting, and it has a class name. And the element font specifies where this control gets its font specification from, either from the property, that means this property here, or it can be inside of the CSS. That means it's either in this HTML file or in the project-specific HTML file. So setting this element class name to form control, where does this come from? It comes from the Bootstrap specification. So if you look at the Bootstrap documentation, you will find these class names. For the button, you see button, button primary. The button class makes an element a button, and the additive specification of button primary makes it a blue button, a primary button, as they refer to it in the Bootstrap world. So running this, looks completely different compared to before. Now each of the controls has a round border, and the add button looks like you're used to from other web pages. Also, note the header that is not part of your design. Where do you find it? Well, as said, you go to the HTML of the form, and in that code you find the header specification with the image tags, certain divs, to create the web design for the header. I have to point out that this text here, demo showing a Bootstrap theme, is visible, going back to the web design, is visible as part of the header, even though the header is not visible inside of the form designer. That is something you can do easily with TMS Web Core. You can link HTML tags to controls. The documentation tells you which controls can be bound to which HTML tag. So looking here, we have a T-Web label, and the element ID is description. And if we move over to the HTML file, we can look for a description, or we see it right here, that a span element can be bound to description. This is the ID. This is just the placeholder text, which will be replaced when the application is being run. So that way you can have a web design completely loosely coupled to your application design. The next step then is to use a template completely designed externally and just linking your elements to this design. And that is shown in the template UI demo. Going over to Unit 1, which is the main form. It looks rather cryptic, especially if you run it now. You see that the design doesn't show up at all in the designer like this. TMS Web Core comes with a preview feature that you see the form design in the browser at design time. So don't worry, this is not just like looking at something you don't know what it's going to look like when you run your application. There is a preview feature, but this is the layout as it has been downloaded from a designer. And the elements of the form, as you can see here with the order number, have been linked to existing design. And also the navigation here on the list is comprised of a menu frame, as it is called. What is menu frame? Well, it's a frame, and you can define frames here. You see that? Frame. T menu frame is class T frame. So TMS Web Core now also has frame support. And this frame shows something that shows you the power of TMS Web Core when it comes to object-oriented programming, because you can create the forms that I clicked on, because this is the navigation. You can create the forms dynamically, meaning you write one generic launch form method, and then you simply pass the different form classes that you want to show, and that way you can have one generic navigation that launches all the other forms. How is everything linked to the design? Again, you go to the HTML file of the form, and you notice that everything has been kept as is from the original author, Creative Tim. No modifications have been made. The only thing that has been added, most likely, are these IDs. And if you move down, you will sure find ID title and other things where your content is being replaced. Also, you cannot only replace single controls. If you go on the form, you also find the form container, which is web form. So you can also designate the form design to appear at a certain place inside of your web design. There's many variations that are available for your web design with TMS Web Core. Just remember that you can completely separately develop your application from the web design. So HTML, CSS, and all those web-specific technologies will never stand in your way to write a great Delphi TMS Web Core application. The final part I have promised is the Miletus demonstration. So here is the photo editor that is also bundled as an example with the product. You can see right away that the project looks a little bit different. Of course, you have icons that are needed for a desktop application, and you have an about box, and the main form right here looks like, also in the designer, looks like a real Windows desktop application form. And the controls are the same as before. You use T-Web controls, not anything else from the VCL. For example, here's the T-Web image control. Everything is from TMS Web. The difference is the base class for the form, for example. So there's tiny little differences that it's not T-Form or T-Web form, it's T-Miletus form. But that is about all that is different, with a few differences when it comes to form management. Because you obviously in the web browser you have only one active form, whereas in a desktop application you can have multiple open forms. So running this from the IDE, shows the power of TMS Web Core with Miletus. You get a desktop window based on a web application. You can even open a photo. Let's open this photo right here. And now you should sincerely doubt what I just showed you, because I'm talking about web applications and still I'm accessing local resources. And that normally is a big no-no. And that's exactly what Miletus lets you do. Even though you develop with a framework that is designed for web applications, you still can access local resources that are usually only possible to be used in a desktop application. So it being a web application is not a downside for your application development. You can still use local resources. And that's the big thing, because if you have a web application, you have no access to the local system. Just think about when you want to store something on a web application, you need to upload the information using the browser. It's not like that the browser allows you to pick a file from your directory. It's the upload feature of your browser that you send the information to the web application, and then the web application can store it. However, a Miletus application can really access local resources. What also makes it so interesting is that thinking of image components, normally image components are not very flexible in the standard VCL controls. So how do we do this using a standard component? You might think that TMS has extended their image control and this is just some magic that they do. No, actually, we're talking web application development. And that means that in addition to being able to use JavaScript libraries, you're also able to use CSS. So what is happening here is that the image is being styled using CSS, using filter, grayscale, contrast, and other CSS-specific properties. But it gets even better. As you can access local resources, you're also able to access databases because desktop applications run in your local area network. So you should be able to access databases. Normally, as I said, web applications can't do this, but the web application is just something so you can develop for each platform. And Miletus then gives you the ability with its database drivers to access databases. Here's an example for a SQLite database that the to-do list that is being accessed using the Miletus SQLite driver with a client data set and a web data source, which is the TMS-specific T data source. And just like in the VCL, you can link your grid to the data source, here the web data source, and the web data source is of course linked to the Miletus client dataset, and the dataset of course uses the SQLite DB driver to access the database. Here's the application accessing the database with database-bound controls, combo box, and of course the usual Delphi-specific navigator controls and buttons that are linked to update, delete, new task, and stuff like that. So everything is as if you were writing a desktop application, just that you're producing a desktop application that can be used on any platform. And that's the final point I want to make. Before we do that, let's look at a few more things. Of course, the source code should not be different from what you're used from the VCL, and it isn't. As we use the T dataset model, the dataset has cancel, delete, post, insert. You have access through the fields using field by name. The whole T dataset infrastructure has been implemented. There is no difference. Connecting to the different databases does depend on the database that you use. For example, for SQLite database, which is file-based, you provide the file name, but you also have access to the more advanced features like journal mode, locking mode, etc. What databases are available? We filter by Miletus, and we see that we have access to Access, MySQL, SQLite, Postgres, Microsoft SQL Server, Interbase, and Firebird. Also, as we're on the topic of local resources, you may specify open dialogues, save dialogues, and main menu, pop-up menu, all things that are not common in web applications but are easily accessible using Miletus. Also, you can access a tray icon, you can monitor directories, you can use global shortcuts. Everything is included in the base version of TMS Web Core. Miletus is not a separate product. Going back to the photo editor, you can have a look at the build configurations. And you'll find debug and release, but you also find Win32, Win64, Linux, macOS. And that's how easy it is to produce a Linux application, for example, from the IDE. Let's first do the release Windows application. Release means there is no debug information inside of the application. You can right-click the project, show in Explorer, TMS Web, and release. And there is the executable, and additionally, also the WebView 2 loader is being deployed as well, but that is something that should be present on most Windows 10 systems through Microsoft Update by now. If not, that is just security. So you have it. But otherwise, it's one executable file with the whole application. I can double click it, and there it is. Let's close it. And let me show you how easy it is to create a macOS application. I double click on macOS, compile, no PA server, nothing else is needed, no different compiler. And also, let me do the Linux 64 right away, compile. I show this intentionally so you see how quick this is. Right click, or you can go to the Explorer again, TMS Web. You get one directory for each of the different operating systems that you selected. Linux 64. Here's the executable. And in addition, you get this desktop link. If you use Ubuntu, you will see a little icon on your desktop. And the same for macOS, my editor, and there's the application and the entitlements. That's something you need for macOS. So hopefully I could show you the power of Miletus that you get if you develop web applications instead of standard desktop applications, what kind of advantages you will have in the future. So these were the examples that I wanted to show you, focusing on form design to deliver applications that are truly cross-platform and run on any device with a user interface that is even responsive for each of the devices that you might use. Because this is such a huge area, web development, I could only touch the surface of what is possible. However, TMS Web Core comes with a documentation that is very, very detailed. It has more than 500 pages and explains the main topics of web development, in addition to being a reference of all the components and controls that are available. Also, on the YouTube channel, you might find 1 or 2 videos from me and other team members from TMS. There's also plenty of blog posts. There's the support forum where you can ask questions. And Wagner Landgraf has a training course available on the internet. And of course, I wrote a book. It's available in English and in German about TMS Web Core. You can order it on Amazon. And if you want more hands-on Delphi development with TMS Web Core, but also with other new technologies like REST, JSON, reporting, map applications, please have a look at my Hands-on Delphi series, which is also available on Amazon. Thank you so much for your interest in this session, for the invitation to this conference, and I'm available for your questions now.